With this being where the MonsterVerse actually started, and our ongoing saga of what happened to Godzilla from Godzilla 2014 all the way to the Wingard Saga, with the next video on this going to be about the Wingard problem in particular, I realized it might actually be important to talk about Kong Skull Island first. When it came to Godzilla 2014, it was actually made as a standalone movie, which, while it was very open-ended with its ending, Gareth Edwards actually hates sequel hooks, and had a very deliberate point of making the movie a self-contained story with no sequel hooks. Kong Skull Island was actually the exact opposite. Hello everyone, I'm Max Allo, your American Allosaurus, and this is gonna be a bit of a big one, because we gotta go all the way back to 2013 for where Kong Skull Island actually started. Originally, what would become Kong Skull Island was envisioned by Peter Jackson as having a sequel to his 2005 King Kong movie, where he hand-picked Adam Wingard to direct this. However, the project eventually transferred studios, and both of them were subsequently dropped from this project. This, I think, likely explains his later treatment of Kong in the MonsterVerse. And by 2014 San Diego Comic-Con, there were already plans to have Godzilla vs. Kong happen. This is because despite the fact that Godzilla 2014 was a self-contained movie, it did so successfully on its opening weekend, a trilogy was greenlit, that being Godzilla King of the Monsters and the subsequent Godzilla vs. Kong. Something which necessitated the Kong Skull Island movie to be included and subsumed within the eventual MonsterVerse. All three of these movies, KOTM, Godzilla vs. Kong, and Kong Skull Island, all came out roughly a year later than was actually originally planned to come out. That is not to say that Kong Skull Island is a bad movie, far from it. I think it is by far the best movie in the MonsterVerse, and there's a lot of things that future MonsterVerse movies can actually learn from it, so long as Toho actually allows there to be future MonsterVerse movies. Taking cues from making the characters actually likable, and having them simply be along for the ride rather than actually somewhat attempting to shape the story and letting the monsters do their thing, all the while they are slowly piecing together the actual story and figuring everything out. This, of course, is to balance with excellent kaiju battle action, with those battles in particular being done in such a way to allow the personality of the kaiju to come through. Kong, in particular with Skull Island, is an exceptional underdog. They show this very well by having him be shown as wounded, bleeding, and just going about his business before needing to fix the mistakes that humanity makes by messing up his island. When it comes to specifically his combat style, he is much less of a brute force battler and again, far from being invincible, while compared to Godzilla. When it comes to Godzilla 2014, he does rely far more on brute force. He shrugs off almost everything thrown at him, including heavy military firepower, and it takes the combination of the two Muto ganging up on him to have a chance. In combat one-on-one, he utterly dominates both of them. Kong, once more, is the exact opposite. While he is very much strong, he is far more overmatched by both the human weaponry brought to face him, being simple high-volume force multipliers, and the Skull Devil itself, with even the Skull Crawlers somewhat giving him a hard time. The struggle in battle and his reliance on fighting cleverly and having to use tools makes him a far more compelling character to watch, and all the more satisfying to see win. A lot of this has sadly been lost with the Wingard Saga taking over, and repeatedly trying to portray Kong as Godzilla's equal in physical combat, something which is the complete antithesis of the very point of him. If you guys haven't done so already, don't forget to comment your thoughts below and subscribe for more, and leave a like on the video. It is stuff like that that makes everything go smoothly around here and helps this channel grow larger and larger so we can bring you more amazing, colossal kaiju content. Story-wise, once again, one of the biggest strengths of the movie is its decision to actually break from the original story. Like Godzilla 2014 didn't go back to the mutant subaquatic dinosaur story, instead reinventing Godzilla to be an ancient primordial species. The same thing is done with Kong with respect to the original story of the ape, Beauty and the Beast style story. They use the character Kong, but built an entirely different story and use really almost nothing in common with the original story beyond there's a giant monkey and there's natives on the island. There are of course many callbacks to it, but story-wise it's almost completely different. And rather than actually portraying Kong as a monster, he is more or less the only one that is portrayed in the story to be the morally correct character to root for. There is no hint of really grayness or murkiness with him. What he is doing is the default good. The only other one that's somewhat similar is actually Hank Marlowe, someone who came from the outside world and understands the world he is now in. With respect to the kaiju personalities, much like KOTM, it has a very heavy focus on actually portraying them via combat. We've been over this a little bit before. It gives the kaiju room to stretch, and not even just Kong, the skull crawlers, and a lot of the other monsters on the island. It almost feels like sort of a documentary style movie with just showing these creatures behaving as actual animals rather than vicious monsters, while still having everything be more or less unhinged. And it does all of this while still having well-written and mostly likable human characters. Even if you don't agree with all the characters' various associated personality traits and quirks, they're still mostly compelling enough to want to see them get off the island. Really, with the exception of Neves, who is the annoying Landsat guy, and the deliberately made unlikable Packard, who is a human antagonist in the movie. Personally, I don't really care for Brie Larson's character. I don't really think her acting was that good, but more or less everyone does at least have a pretty good character arc throughout the movie. This is something that none of the other MonsterVerse films have done. Not even Godzilla 2014, which did get the closest. The only thing that really held it back was Aaron Taylor Johnson's acting, or really lack thereof. Later saying on series like The Avengers and Godzilla, he didn't give an F about them. Sadly, that is something that could have been avoided had they gone with Henry Cavill, someone who was actually on the shortlist to play Lord Brody. But since we are also slightly changing up the format of this, I think we also need to actually go into a sort of a summary of the movie. Because unlike with the previous one, which was basically just about covering two movies and talking about select parts from it, I think we gotta dive pretty deep into this movie because there's really just so much it does right. So we are actually going full circle into going to become a movie review channel like the original idea was. It begins with an exceptionally strong introduction, while also being fairly quick, and it is very much to the point. It establishes the setting, establishes Kong's presence, and again, in direct opposition to Godzilla 2014, it really does not delay introducing us to the kaiju. And as a bit of a personal side note, I do very much like the idea of using the World War II setting to first ground the very start of the movie, having Gunpei and Hank Marlowe, their little exchange fight without any words. Yeah, when you have an opening that goes on for, 5+ minutes with not a single word being uttered and it draws you in, that is already an exceptional sign of you're doing great writing. Since it does a great job of establishing that even in a world of monsters, humans are still human, and this is before the monsters have really become known, something that we really didn't get to see a whole lot of when it came to Godzilla 2014. Again, as I mentioned, I do like the vast majority of the human side story, and it is very compelling from the get-go. I like how they handle and set up Randa and Brooks, the geology guy, since you get the feeling Rand is actually a bit off right from the start, but he is correct about what he's talking about. In contrast to how they do Bernie Hayes pretty much half a decade later, being so ridiculously and gratuitously over the top, it kind of undermines the whole character who is crazy but right. Again, a lot of things I could have learned from this. While Brooks is a lot more grounded and he speaks much more plainly, the only slight criticism I guess I could kind of give to this whole sequence is that with hopping around the different locations, first you have, Randa in DC, then you go to the military base, then you go all the way over to the island where they recruit Tom Hiddleston's character. They introduce a lot of characters really quickly. In particular, when introducing the grunts, it is very noticeable that they're just kind of character loading right now. I get why they did it, and it does work very well in kind of getting into the action of the movie, because the movie it's like 2 hours long. So doing this, it some kind of feels a little bit rushed, but also it's not too aggressively overbearing. Again, the only real introduction I can say that I don't think was too strong is the introduction of Mason, which, again, I think that Brie Larson's acting is one of the 3 weaknesses of the movie. Again, if that. They do exposition also pretty well in the movie. Like, you don't have massive, just freaking 5-minute long exposition dumps. It's slowly sprinkled throughout things, and they also don't re-explain anything. It also actually understands a pretty good degree of subtlety in that you're not really supposed to trust characters, especially Packard and Randa, with just little small glances like when Brooke says, you told them to arm the choppers, you're not going to tell them why? And then Randa just brushes it off as like, I don't want to cause a panic. Again, respecting the audience and their attention span, and rather than just spoon-feeding them and everything, that's a degree of writing that you don't really get much from in, again, modern MonsterVerse and even most movies these days. Plus, the whole chopper sequence is actually one of my favorite scenes in the entire movie. The introduction just to the world of Skull Island it's beautiful. It gives me a lot of Jurassic Park vibes when they're doing the helicopter fly over the island, but just shifted. Something just feels very off, and it feels almost otherworldly. Something that works, considering the entire idea of Skull Island is that it's a piece of the hollow earth that is basically just on the surface, so it more or less is a completely otherworldly place. And as such, the look of everything on it, the lighting just feels off. But there is still that touch of awe. Especially when everything is going as planned, they're dropping the seismic charges, before everything goes full tilt completely unhinged when Kong enters the playing field. And they play Kong as terrifyingly straightforward as they can. And this is only about 20 minutes into the movie, keep in mind. Despite the fact that Kong is only about 104 feet tall at this time, he feels powerful. He is throwing just trees at the choppers. He grabs the choppers, and again, a part of this has to do with, because he's actually a lot smaller, he's able to more directly and personally interact with the choppers, unlike Godzilla, where before he was just almost indifferent to things around him because everything was just so small. At the same time, he is actually shown to be somewhat vulnerable, because his hand gets cut by the blades. When they're using the big heavy-duty M60s, he is shown to, feel pain from being shot by them. Keep in mind, those are about 30 cal rounds coming from it instead of the big heavy-duty 50 cals we see a bit later in the movie. So the fact that comparatively small arms fire is able to wound him, or at least he feels something from them, probably akin to maybe like a pinprick like to us, it helps to humanize him despite the fact that he is portrayed utterly terrifyingly here. And it also makes you feel a little bit more conflicted because the humans are fairly likable. Again, even though Packard is later portrayed as the human antagonist of the movie, he is still portrayed as a relatively good commanding officer right here. it combines that right amount of just horror and spectacle that is very difficult to match, especially with creativity, because every single one of his chopper kills is actually unique. Since it also does a very good job of showing that this is where the script kind of flips, in that humanity is not really the good guy in this scenario. Or at least we're not the good guys yet. We are invading Kong's home, and he is simply defending it. Again, as I brought up a little bit earlier, when it comes to just the characters walking around the island, experiencing and seeing all of the other creatures, it doesn't feel like just an island crawling with monsters. It feels like an island that is actually populated by just simply supersized regular animals. You have this weird part kaiju film, part nature documentary setting that's played for both horror in cases like The Mother Longlegs, but then in other cases it's portrayed more softly with cases like the Skeeter Buffalo. It shows that a lot of love and a lot of care went into making scenes like this so that everything had more weight and impact. It also never feels at any point like, oh, these are setups for later boss monsters, that it's very well done set dressing. Again, considering that Kong Skull Island was made very clearly with the plan of the MonsterVerse existing, it shows a lot of restraint, and most of the movie, 99.9% of the movie, falls into that self-contained encapsulated system that Godzilla 2014 did so well. On the subject of more specifically Kong's portrayal outside of battle, there's this almost majesty, this nobility to him. He feels powerful and imposing, but in other scenes we get to see a more vulnerable side of him, specifically when he is cleaning his wounds, when he's eating the octopus he actually just simply beats, and when he is just shown drinking water. It shows that he's really no different than we are. So that, unfortunately, they would in later movies take to a unfortunate extreme. It shows a great combination of intelligence and savagery. The Iwi are much the same way. It's just the storytelling with them purely in the visuals, they don't really talk, and the general almost silence of the interactions with the army bros and the scientist guys, with Hank's very brief descriptions of things, with the actual, cutting over to Kong fighting the smaller skull crawlers, just, I love it. It's so good. And also a slight little detail when if you watch the movie and you notice, when inside the wall with the Iwi village, everything is calm, is peaceful, the lighting is a lot more stable. But when they're outside of the walls, everything's a lot more unhinged, unnerving, the lighting is a lot more erratic. Being that Kong protects the Iwi, it really helps to punctuate that Kong is the one thing of stability keeping this island together. Because when he's around, the lighting is not nearly as erratic, even when Brie Larson's character leaves the wall and we see the buffalo trapped underneath the helicopter. When Kong, again, showing his compassion and altruism, he lifts the helicopter off and tosses it aside, the lighting is also a lot more stable. He doesn't have that erratic orange glow. But it also shows that, he's not happy with humanity, since he recognized that Brie Larson's character is among the group that is invading and disturbing his home. Since we also get to see a lot more of Kong, it is very impressive they were able to strike a very balanced story with enough time devoted to Hank, to Kong, and the rest of the people that came to the island. Especially Hank's story is just, it's kind of wholesome. Seeing him banter with the people who come to the island about things like the Cold War and him not really understanding any of it. The questions like, so they take the summers off? Being that he's 30 years out of the loop, he has no idea about any of those things. Things like the moon landing and a little bit of banter with Slivko about baseball. And since most of the humans are actually given fairly equal screen time, with pretty much the acceptance of Chaplin, it was not obvious who was going to get offed. Chaplin was pretty much the only one that it was very obvious he was going to get offed. And you're mostly invested in all of them, so you're hoping that they don't get offed, other than Neves. Pretty much the second criticism I can say of the movie is I am sad we never got to say Gunpei and Hank's story of them interacting, before everything. But I can kind of forgive that because the story we got was actually, pretty well done. And the characters are believably terrified out of their minds. The reactions are believable and realistic, while at the same time also kind of tongue-in-cheek. Again, kind of circling back to the entire thing about, the living, breathing nature of the island with the boneyard. It's just, that scene is unsettling in the best way. You have the Kong skeletons, the dinosaur bones littered about. It makes the movie feel like it is part of, yes, a much larger world, but it doesn't feel like... But because they don't go out of the way to explain every little detail, it feels so much better. Like, it feels natural. It flows better. It makes the world feel a lot more lived in kind of the same way that Star Wars Episode 4 did. And I do really love the skull crawlers. They're just that right mix of creepy and cool. And one of the most just creative scenes I've ever seen in a monster movie, especially after eating Randa, is just the flash of the camera going off inside of its stomach, and you see just the light being blocked by its bones, and the character trying to find it from the flash going off. Is like, you give them the fog to add the eeriness, then you give them a way to find the thing even in the fog. It's like, it adds to just the creep and suspense factor. Though, again, this is kind of like one little oddity of the movie, I will say. I do find it slightly odd that the much smaller Skullcrawler is more or less unaffected by the small, relatively arms fire, considering that Kong was at least affected, or at least felt something from the same and actually smaller caliber weapons. They were using an M16 on Kong earlier on in the movie, which is a 7.62 by 51mm cartridge, which is roughly a 30 caliber round. Where here, Packard says set up the 50, which is an M2 Ma Deuce 50 cal machine gun. So they're firing something that is significantly larger at the Skullcrawler, and it just doesn't look like it does anything. I get it's really cool, but I mean, I guess maybe because of the shooting at the head of it, I guess. But it is one little kind of weird inconsistency. But it does go a good bit into showing that, the Skullcrawlers are... They're a bigger threat. Because Kong doesn't shrug them off, and the Skullcrawlers do shrug it off. Yes, I do mildly like firearms. I find them fascinating. Again, before, as I said, they didn't go with the original story of, Kong falls in love with the human girl, and that's how the whole thing happens, and they chain Kong and bring him back. Again, love that they did not go with that. You can see that there is, elements of that used here where Kong sees Conrad and Mason on the top of the mountain, and then Kong gets distracted by Packard's trap. But it's more of just his natural curiosity and, seeing these two humans that are outsiders, and then learning, oh, they do not mean me harm, these are friend humans. Before seeing Packard and, the hostile humans, which... I also like that they don't have all the grunts under Packard's command be 110% as gung-ho as he is. Some of them seem to be a little unsettled by the degree Packard is going to, as well as I very much appreciate that Kong actually loses the fight against them. Something that allows when the Skull Devil appears to just wipe Kong. And as for the Skull Devil fight itself... Love all of this. I appreciate that they do not have it set during night. The only part of the fight that is really set during nighttime is the very brief, introduction and the fight against Packard and the grunts, but all of it is very well lit. Slight criticism I will say, The intro is a little bit janky, like the Skullcrawler's like jumping out of the water and then landing. That part does look a little bit weird, but I mean, again, impact, real cool. And by having the Skull Devil just beat Kong right out of the get-go and have him basically be down and out for presumably a couple hours or something, or not a couple hours ago, a couple minutes, it lets them transition believably over into a daytime morning chase scene for the first half of the fight. Well, not even really first half, like first maybe like 20% of it. So that way you get the suspense of, the human characters are in danger and a believable reason for why the humans are involved in the final fight. The Skull Devil, like these Skull Crawlers, is constantly hungry. So something even a small meal like a human is what it needs to eat. And it wants them. And this chase doesn't really last long. It gets immediately back to Kong being in the action, they have it brightly lit, and they've got some great fighting moves between everything. Kong tries to go for the classic jawbreaker, it doesn't work, so he just slams the Skull Devil into the side of a mountain. Their battle motions as a whole feel very natural. They feel like this is what these creatures would actually be doing, with Kong primarily relying on tools and having to fight cleverly and exploit openings, while the Skull Devil is much faster. It fights more ferally, using its tail, its claws. Both of them grapple with one another, but in different ways. And Kong also exploits the fact that the hunger is distracting the Skull Devil. A special mention goes not only to Kong literally grabbing a mountain and just frickin' cracking it on the Skull Devil's skull, grabbing a tree and using it like a baseball bat, but most of all, after Kong is thrown into the ship wreckage, the grappling hook propeller chain. That is just, the amount of hype that is just unrivaled. Especially because you can see Kong, the sparks connector's like, oh, I can use this as a weapon. And he just freaking throws it. It would look ridiculous otherwise, but because they set up that Kong, as intelligent as he is using tools, understanding how to fight in different, more creative ways, it works. And especially after that, he doesn't just use it as the grappling hook like a lasso to pull in the Skull Devil, he uses it and grabs it and uses it almost like a knife to slash its throat. Again, in conjunction with some wrestling throws that he uses, it shows the personalities of the kaiju and lets them infiltrate the fight by establishing character via combat. Visual exposition, show don't tell. And let's just give it up for that brutal kill. Like, I mean, Kong literally rips that thing's guts out at the end. I didn't expect that. And even now it's like, oh, that's messed up, but I like it. As well as, again, there's actually pretty minimal cutaways. Like, there are humans involved, but they don't constantly cut away. But with the battle done and over, I'm glad they don't just have the movie more or less cut to an end right there. We do get a good, good couple minutes with the characters. After everything is ended, they reflect on their experience. And most critically, that I think is the best part about the movie, is while the credits are rolling, you get to see Hank go home. This was, even if the characters reflecting on, what they learned from the island and how, everything's got to stay here, that they can't really, tell what they had. Which I think Conrad's scene on that was a little bit belabored. The scene with Marlowe going home was incredibly necessary. Him getting his happy ending that he deserves after 30 years away from his family. Getting to see his son, see his wife, and just all of it without any dialogue was beautiful. On its own, up until this exact point of the movie, it is a fantastic standalone movie. There is very much a lot of room for expansion and world building. However, this is where I do gotta say is not something that I am personally happy with the movie. I have very mixed feelings on the King Ghidorah teaser. While I like it, I like how well it is done, I think it is very clever. I also don't like how it makes the movie somewhat feel like it was obligatory setup for Godzilla King of the Monsters and for Godzilla vs. Kong. Again, they knew that they were going to be making King of the Monsters. Again, back in 2014, they knew they were making KOTM, and they knew that at that same time they were going to be making Godzilla vs. Kong. So yes, it was all planned out. And again, both Kong Skull Island and KOTM were planned to come out a year earlier, thus making the teaser actually a lot more impactful, because in the timeline of release timelines, it wouldn't have been a 5-year delay between everything. Now, of course, because Kong Skull Island, KOTM, and GVK all got pushed back around roughly a year, it does kind of stretch things out, which is what makes this feel a little bit worse, because it does come off like they were kind of jumping the gun in planning all these big things before Kong Skull Island was even finished. If the story was more or less cut off at the Hank Marlowe scene ending, it would be a flawless standalone Kong film. Now, I will also say, I may not be the best to talk about sequel hooking and criticism of it, considering for my own kaiju stories, I have far more ideas planned out before even finishing my first story. So, hey. But in all seriousness, I do think this is by far the strongest story of the MonsterVerse, the best film in the MonsterVerse. It combines great action with great storytelling, and overall, even though technically Godzilla 2014 is the first, quotes, of the series, this was the first one that was actually designed to be the first movie in the MonsterVerse, and it holds up extremely well. It introduces a new iteration of Kong who is extremely compelling, and while I can't say that I think this movie reinvented the kaiju genre, I think it is archetypically what the kaiju genre should aspire to be more like. I do have a lot of worries about the future of the MonsterVerse. Again, with Toho announcing, or at least a very high executive producer of Heisei and Millennium era Godzilla movies, saying that he wants Toho to more or less make their own Monster of the Week story for Godzilla, with releasing a new movie year after year, it does call into question a lot of the future of the MonsterVerse. Since Toho's getting its butt in gear, they're working on Shin Godzilla 2, they're working on Godzilla -1 sequel, and now this. They are going into turbo ultra mega overdrive when it comes to Godzilla content. And whether or not that means they are going to revoke the ability of Legendary to continue utilizing Godzilla is unknown. It's also hard to kind of blame Toho if that does happen. We are going to be going over in a future video the lack thereof of an American Godzilla problem. It doesn't actually exist. However, there are unfortunately more things that add fuel to the arguments in favor of it, which I want to address. Since the American Godzilla movies have very much been plagued by a litany of problems, from mid-production rewrites to a global lockdown to a self-sabotaging director, and subdividing its own focus far too much for its own good. The fact that the comics and peripheral material exist to bail out the movies for poor writing choices, fixing self-contradictory plots, and justifying and set up plot devices and future pretty stupid plot lines is not a good sign. All the while trying to go for a bigger, more explosive, more extravagant story each and every time. The solution was staring at them in the face from the very beginning when it came to how to make the MonsterVerse more successful. Godzilla 2014 and Kong Skull Island are those movies. A smaller, self-contained, more or less, story and human-scale characters that actually care about, or at least have an involvement in the monsters, to the point where we get invested in them, rather than just... Since, while the human side of the story has always been very important, even in the Toho Godzilla movies, the human story always took a pretty substantial focus. The kaiju were always a very large part of that even still. MonsterVerse movies since KOTM have felt more like family dramas that just happen to be taking place inside of a kaiju universe, rather than a story that features humans that revolves around the kaiju. And both Skull Island and Godzilla 2014 did this masterfully. I do look forward to Supernova. I hope it's good, but I am worried. I don't quite know when we're going to be going over the next installment of this sort of MonsterVerse saga, since these kind of videos are pretty massive, and there's... If I dwell too much on it, I will go into a doom spiral. I want to thank you guys. Again, if you haven't done so already, please don't forget to leave a like, subscribe for more. I guess I gotta give the movie a rating. I give Kong Skull Island, what, 9 cracked skull crawlers, 9 cracked skull devils out of 10, I guess is probably the best way to put it. Again, great movie, all around everything is fantastic. A few things I would change, like, again, some scenes with Monarch feel a little bit too setup baity, but overall just near flawless. I do think this is the best movie of the MonsterVerse. Love the way they did Kong. I kind of hope at some point we maybe get like a story like with Gunpei and like that whole thing, how that worked out. But yeah, overall, I'm very satisfied with this movie, and very much look forward to hopefully getting like future solo Kong stories. Like that's what I want. No more tag teams, please. But yeah, no, I've been Max Allo, and I'll see you guys next time. Well, long live the Kaiju King, and let me know what you guys want to see more of. I guess now, long live the Kaiju King.